Ary Rosenbaum here with another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. This week's topic, we're going to talk about why changing 401k plan providers is harder than it should be, and still a good thing worth doing. First things first, go to that 401ksite.com, sign up for all our events. April 16th, Chicago, May 5th, Denver, Colorado. That will probably be a wrap for 2026. I'll think about Washington and see how I feel about it. It's getting more and more difficult to have these events. I think it's ever been since COVID. We'll, like I said, try to do 2 to 3 of these events a year. By the time this episode drops, I'll hope to have some guest announcements. I've been rather late for that. A little difficulty there, but we will have guests involved. But let's sign up for the events. Got lunch, stadium tour, all that kind of stuff, and of course, go to Amazon.com. The book, that 401k Plan Provider Handbook, as well as Full Circle, are available in paperback and Kindle. So, when it comes to changing retirement plan providers, plan sponsors just don't wake up in the morning and say, yeah, we're going to change our plan provider. It's, you're dealing with long-term relationships. It's hard to change. Familiarity in this business is mistaken for safety. And, we're always warning plan sponsors on how difficult it is to change. But, I'm not talking about change for the sake of change, which I always hate. I hate the idea of we're going to change for the sake of change. Change has to happen for a reason. But there are times, where a change will do you good, which reminds me of the Sheryl Crow song off of her album, I think it was called Sheryl Crow. And it's funny about music, I'll remember buying an album. I don't know if you buy an album these days, but there's certain music that I would pick up, and it would remind me. The certain songs would remind me of a certain period of time, and I want to say the Sheryl Crow album is 95, 96. That was the second year of law school. It's always funny how things, you remember that album, just like I remember if it was a big focus of Full Circle, where the title of the book comes from is the Nine Lives album by Aerosmith. And every single time I listen to that, I'm reminded that album came out my final kind of semester of law school, and how that is one of my favorite albums of all time, even though it's probably Aerosmith's got 4 or 5 albums that are probably better, but just you reminded yourself of that time. But A Change Would Do You Good is a good song. It Makes You Happy is probably my favorite song off that album, which is the first single. And there was the Every Day's a Winding Road, I think was from that album. But anyway, that song, really isn't about chaos or reinvention for its own sake. It's about recognizing when something familiar has quietly stopped serving its purpose. And, that's when plan sponsors really have to consider making a change. They aren't unhappy enough to move, but they aren't confident enough to say things that are, working either. And fiduciary duty doesn't reward comfort or loyalty, it rewards judgment. And, when a plan sponsor sees that a provider relationship has gone stale and needs to change, they just can't, stay and just keep it for, stability's sake. And, if they do that, it's deferred responsibility, and that's something that could pop up later and be an absolute mistake. Vendor resistance is part of that whole business model of changing, and one of the reasons changing providers feels so difficult is that outgoing vendors don't cooperate very enthusiastically. People don't like to be fired, especially in the TPA world. Always reminds me of the TV show The Real World, where they always had the intro, and once you start fighting, you stop becoming, stop being friends, and everything's great and hunky dory until it isn't. And plan providers are very, very nice and helpful until they get fired. Well, at least a lot of them. And I've been in some really touchy situations. I've always told the story of the CPA that I had to file a DOL complaint because they were holding us up for 80 grand for fees that we already paid. Um, you know, and that's a problem. And sponsors, are kind of threatened about disruption when they make a change for plan providers. And a lot of times these providers take these things personally and they mess things up. And plan sponsors with this change are often stunned by how hard it is to retrieve information that really belongs to them. Payroll histories, compliance testing, plan amendments, participant data, all that stuff. And plan sponsors sometimes are not held at gunpoint, but they have to pay a lot in fees and in arrears and deconversion fees and all that stuff in order to get what really is rightfully theirs. And you know, that's one of the reasons that a lot of plan sponsors don't make the change. Same thing with they have an annuity-based contract and there's a surrender value or stable value change that is going to with a market value adjustment. These are problems, and the problem is that all these changes and scare tactics give the illusion that for the plan sponsor to do nothing, it's a safer bet. And inertia is really often mistaken for prudence. Sponsors convince themselves that staying put avoids mistakes, scrutiny, and risks. But the problem is that inaction is not a neutral fiduciary position. Courts don't reward loyalty to underperforming providers. Regulators don't excuse outdated practices because relationships are long-standing. A plan that hasn't been competitively reviewed in years is exposed, even if even nothing has gone visibly wrong. Fiduciary duty is measured by process, not intentions, and a refusal to ever consider changing undermines the credibility of that process. And transitions in this business do go bad. Um, plan provider changes sometimes fail, and it's rarely because the change itself was a mistake. It's because the transition wasn't treated like the fiduciary project it is. Timelines are rushed, internal payroll teams are looped in too late, and responsibilities aren't clear, and sponsors assume vendors will handle details that no one is actually owning. And these failures reinforce the myth that transitions are inherently chaotic when the big problem really is poor planning and unrealistic expectations. But having worked for TPAs, the problem is, we would screw up a transition or whatever it was, it never got any better. And sometimes that was the fault of the administrator and misinterpreting the document or the conversion staff, not getting the changes that needed to be in place. And that's a huge problem. And again, the more problematic the transitions would go, the less likely, the increased likelihood we would be fired within the first, year to 3 years. And one of the most persistent fears out there for plan sponsors is that participants are going to have a negative reaction to any kind of change. And sponsors have this weird idea of confusion, anger, and loss of trust. In reality, participants adapt quickly when communication is clear and timely. And also, what I've always said about employees, they are not the type of people that are going to say, raise a stink when it comes to a retirement plan. They don't want to, rock the boat. Former employees will love to rock the boat. The biggest Department of Labor complaints I've ever received for clients were because of a former employee, not because of a current employee. And, in reality, participants really, they care about access, clarity, and functionality. They don't really care much about the logo on statements, unless, of course, they're me. And when they move my 401k from a mutual fund company to an insurance-based platform, I was kind of ticked off about that. But when there's a transition that results in better tools, clearer reporting, or lower fees, participants are certainly going to notice. And the absence of noise after a transition isn't proof that the change was unnecessary. It's proof that it did work. And there is a cost of staying too long, with a provider. And I think that one of the worst traits is misplaced loyalty to plan providers. And I've always never understood why sometimes people are loyal to people that they don't need to be. I've used the same mechanic for the last 28 years because he's honest, he's a good man, and his people rarely make mistakes. Had they butchered one of my cars, or caused a leak to a tire or something like that, I probably would have gone somewhere else in the last 28 years. But every year that a plan sponsor is delays reevaluating their plan providers as a year of potentially excessive fees, outdated plan design, or weak governance support. And these costs don't always show up in a balance sheet, but they really compound quietly. There may be missed opportunities for a plan redesign, operational shortcuts that become habits, whatever it is. The most dangerous problems are often the ones that have been tolerated the longest. And switching providers is not really a fiduciary exercise, but switching providers is a fiduciary exercise. It's not just a choice, when you switch from using Ronzoni to Barilla pasta. Too many sponsors approach provider changes the way they'd approach switching vendors in any other business context. And that really misses the point. A provider transition start with an honest assessment of what the plan needs now, not what it needed, 20 years ago. Workforce demographics obviously shift. The plan grows in size, compensation structure changes, whatever it is. A provider that fit perfectly years ago may not fit today. It's like clothing. You lose weight, you gain weight. Clothing may not fit, and clothing styles may no longer fit as well. Which always reminds me about clothing styles is that there are some styles that come back and forth, and my joke is that leisure suits have never come back, and they never will. And I always remind myself about the fashion sense that somehow I've always been very, very lucky with fashion sense. When I was a kid, I had a cousin of mine who was getting married. I was 9 years old, and this was her first of 3 marriages. But the second one didn't count because it was annulled, but it did happen. And anyway, it's one of those situations where they were supposed to get married in 1980, and they broke off, and then they got back together, and they got married the year later. And if you look at the history of it, your first choice is always the best. Your first answer is always the best, and she probably should have stayed single from this guy. But anyway, 1981, light gray. The colors were like light gray and purple, like light gray tuxedos. And I said to my mother, why not a black tuxedo? My mother's like, in her voice, and I did it last week, and I upset my wife by doing that shrieking voice, but, it was, Ary, black, what do you want to do? Go to, what is this, a funeral? As if people wear, and as a kid, you're like, what are you talking about? People don't wear tuxedos to funerals. They wear suits. But anyway, black tuxedos never go out of style. But light gray tuxedos do. When her sister got married about 2.5 years later, they had a dark gray tuxedo that actually looked pretty decent. But anyway, and ruffled shirts never did come back, thankfully. But, that's the point. Styles change, situations change, and what was good, 10 years ago may not be good now. Good providers don't fear being replaced. The providers out there that do a good job, they're not afraid about getting fired. They don't promise, they make no promises. They just do their job. And, they view transitions as opportunities to clean up years of accumulated issues, not just move data from one system to another. I know one provider that, got fired for a payroll provider and didn't take it personally. And, the business did come back. And there's a problem of, we've always used them. Like I said, I've used the same mechanic for the last 28 years. Um, I like familiarity, but, if people are going to screw things up, I'm not going to just sit on it and say, well, I've always done it this way and I'm not going to change. You know, no one wants to offend a longtime contact or admit that something could have been better. And confrontation is very, very uncomfortable, especially when relationships have been friendly and familiar. But fiduciary duty isn't about preserving relationships at the expense of participants. It's about acting in the best interest. And sometimes that means saying goodbye. Some relationships run its course, even if it once made sense and served the plan well. Um, you know, you can look at your life and some of the people that you interacted with 20 years ago. They might have maybe it was because of a job or life changes. They're not part of your life anymore, and that's just the nature of it. Things and times move on. And after a well-executed plan provider change, sponsors almost always say the same thing. They wish they had done it sooner. Um, that's always. It's sometimes like when I discovered how much I loved almond butter or shakshuka, and I'm like, man, where was this all my life? And that's how plan sponsors are when there's a transition that goes really, really well. Participants will adjust and processes improve and governments become clearer. Change doesn't create new problems, it exposes and resolves old ones that were being tolerated out of habit. Oversight became easier, not harder, and confidence replaces anxiety. That relief alone is worth the effort. Changing 401k plan providers is difficult because the industry benefits when sponsors stay still. But it's difficult because fear is easier than evaluation. It's difficult because change forces accountability, but it's still worth doing. A plan that evolves is a plan that's being monitored. A sponsor that is willing to reassess relationships is a sponsor that is willing to take their fiduciary responsibility seriously. And movement, when thoughtful, is a sign of strength, not instability. Again, you go to the same providers. I've seen the same allergist for like last time for 15 years. Just got my shots today, and gonna have to see him soon to see if I no longer need shots. And always get a good report of that office. The office is really well run, and I'll never forget years ago. I had stomach issues, whatever it was. I was overweight, and I went to a gastroenterologist. They did a colonoscopy, and they said that I had not Crohn's disease, but something similar. And anyway, years later, I lost weight. I took a probiotic, and whatever condition I don't have, ulcerative colitis. That was it. Sorry, I just remembered. I like 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. I started taking a probiotic. I lost 40 pounds, and I probably never had ulcerative colitis. But anyway, I went for a follow-up visit to this gastroenterologist, which was like 20 minutes away, and literally I was sitting in the office for 2 hours, and I just like walked out, and that was the end of it. And you just don't have to sit there and take it. And too often, plan sponsors, that's what they do. They sit and they take things, and it's change is an inevitable part. It's the old motto: you're hired to be fired. And the plans that really get plan sponsors into trouble are rarely the ones that change too often. They're the ones that didn't change at all. Stagnation disguises itself as safety in the retirement plan world. But when a sponsor realizes that a relationship is being maintained out of habit rather than value, that realization matters. Sometimes, to borrow from Sheryl Crow, a change really would do you good in a 401k plan that change can be the clearest sign that fiduciary duty is being taken seriously. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of that 401k podcast. And of course, like I said, the events available for that 401ksite.com, as well as check out Amazon.com for first Full Circle, as well as that 401k plan provider handbook available on Kindle and in paperback. And tune in next week for another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. Take care. Bye.